Hey, welcome to On the Clock, a collaboration between the Packaday Pockets and the Giraffe Fellows. I'm Andrew Mertig. That is Kyle Fellows. Together, we are the Giraffe Fellows. And over the next few months, we're going to be taking a look at a series. I don't even know how to do these intros anymore, Kyle. That covers picks 1 through 32, the team's biggest needs, and who they should be considering at their pick. You can check out all the video versions of these episodes at the Draft Fellows YouTube channel. You can also check out all the previous audio at the Packaday channel. Kyle, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I am getting concerned that maybe I need to take over the intro duties and swap you to the
Definitely
outros.
do. You definitely do. There's a few things not going well for me, but we're up to pick 8, episode
We're
8. This is great.
yeah, episode 8, pick 8, Carolina Panthers, and this has been a really fun series. It's been fun just to get to know these teams a little bit better, put them under the microscope to talk about like what are these guys going to do when they're actually on the clock. And Carolina is one of those teams that like so many different directions that they could go, and I think that starts with the defensive line. They could go secondary, they could go corner or safety. And so honestly, if you look at the defensive line, Shy Tuttle, LeBrian Ray, and Ashawn Robinson are kind of the guys there, and they all struggled last season. Like, there's not a lot of upside there, and they struggled. So they could definitely look to go defensive line. At edge, Jadeveon Clowney and DJ Wanham will be in the last years of their deals in 2025. Mike Jackson and JC Horn at corner were just kind of like the definition of average. So just good enough like that they might roll with those guys. They, like had a lot of, I think, reason to believe that those guys can be better than they were last year, but they could definitely use an upgrade at the cornerback position. And then Xavier Woods had a down year in 2024, but played over 1,200 snaps for this team and is now an unrestricted free agent. So they got to get somebody else in there. The rest of that safety position is a hot mess. So they definitely could look to go that direction if they felt like there was a player who was worthy of the pick at 8 overall. But lots of different ways the Carolina Panthers could go early in this draft.
Yeah, we take a look at pivot points in the draft every year. Like, where do things really get interesting? Because that's where you tend to see a lot of action, a lot of trades up, trade down. And I think probably 5 is a pivot point, and then all of a sudden 8 again. And usually you don't see them so close together. But I do think there's sort of like the high value / quarterback players up front in that top 4. 5 through 7, we kind of have a pretty solid idea of what those teams are looking at and some of the players that might fit into that like top category. And here's where it gets really interesting. Like, the Panthers could go in a ton of different directions. I think trade options are definitely a possibility here. They're probably like one of the few teams drafting in the top 10 that should be excited about their late season success.
Yeah,
Unlike a few
yeah,
teams,
yeah.
looking at you, New York Giants, who won some games down the stretch that you're like, maybe wish they didn't win those games because it could have used a better pick. Patriots are another one, but it pushed them down a few spots in the draft order. But the reascension of Bryce Young should give a lot of hope to the Carolina fan base. And I'd love to see the Panthers trade down and add even more young pieces of the roster. Just remember, this is a team that lost out on a lot of draft capital because of that Bryce Young trade. So looking to make that roster a little bit younger, a little bit more talented. If they stay at 8, there's Michigan defensive lineman Mason Graham, or even Michigan defensive lineman Kenneth Grant. Like, yeah, I'm starting to think maybe he could go this high. Texas A&M edge Shamar Stewart, Michigan cornerback Will Johnson. If he were to fall to this point, maybe even somebody like Georgia safety Malachi Starks, because you mentioned the safety need, but they could also look for an offensive weapon, and any one of the wide receivers, or even Penn State tight end Tyler Warren,
Yeah.
which might be unlikely because they drafted Jatavian Sanders last year. But if they think he's special, the Raiders drafted Michael Mayer in the second round and then turn around and drafted Brock Bowers. So
Yep.
just saying it's not impossible. So
Mhm.
a lot of different options. Probably the most interesting one we've done so far. What do you predict that the Panthers are going to do?
I think interesting is the best word for what Carolina could do here, because not only do they have Dave Canellis and like trying to put his stamp on the offense and get that team going in the right direction with Bryce Young at the helm and all those things that a head coach is going to be asking for in a draft throughout an offseason. But then I think that this is probably one of the more interesting teams that like you expect that the owner is going to have his hand in trying to get this thing right. And maybe he's decided, and Dave Tepper has kind of said like, okay, I need to take a step back and kind of let this play out and those kinds of things. But between those things, like the coach having the influence, the owner maybe having there's so many ways that the Panthers could go with this and try not to rush that process, right? Because I think this is team still committed to a rebuild. But I mentioned defensive line and corner and safety as the biggest needs here for Carolina. But this situation is still just kind of a head scratcher because I'm assuming Mason Graham's probably gone. He should be at this point, right? Good player. I predicted that the Jets would take Will Johnson at 7 in our last episode. So go back and listen to that if you want to hear conversation about Will Johnson. Kenneth Grant and Malachi Starks are maybe. You just mentioned like Kenneth Grant might go this high, but I think it possibly reaches at 8 for those players. So at 8, I'm just going to go and have Carolina take edge 2 in this class. And you can talk about which player is edge 2 at this juncture, right? We're going to learn a lot in the next couple weeks to talk about that. That might end up being Marshall's Mike Green. It could be a hybrid player like Jalen Walker, who I think Daniel Jeremiah has going here to Carolina in his last mock. But I'm going to say in this scenario, it's Georgia edge Michael Williams. He played through a nasty ankle injury all year, so we probably didn't get his best ball in 2024. But he's just going to be 20 years old on draft night, so the ceiling for his development and reaching another, a place in his game where it's going to, I think he has maybe the best chance of anyone in the entire draft to have a better pro career than he did a college career. I think the ceiling is sky high for Michael Williams, and I think that the Panthers staying here at 8, it's a great fit for them. And so I'll go Michael Williams here.
Michael Williams is so interesting to me because this is the guy who, by the end of his rookie contract, you could look back and be like, this is a top 3 edge rusher in the NFL.
Yeah.
And how did he fall to pick 8? He has that within his range. The ceiling is infinite. He also could be Vic Beasley.
Yes.
And I don't know how to gauge that risk in this particular draft class because he could go pick 8. He also could go pick 25. I don't know. Like he could fall anywhere in between, but the ceiling is so great. So there's going to be some defensive coordinator and head coach who are confident enough in their skills to develop this young man into being a great pass rusher in this league. And this is weird for me because this is not a player I'm as high on as most people, but I'm going to throw a wild prediction out there and say Arizona wide receiver Tetairoa McMillan will be the pick for the Panthers.
Oh, wow.
I think you get a Drake London-like player to be a physical mismatch, and you add that to a field-stretching tight end in Jadavian Sanders, a deep threat in Xavier Legette, and a nice slot wide receiver in Jalen Coker, and you have a really nice young receiving core to give Bryce Young a chance.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine Dave Canales is going to like having McMillan after getting to work with Mike Evans in Tampa Bay. And McMillan is not Mike Evans. He's not quite that athlete, but similar size, frame, pretty good catcher, physical. I think he's going to like that role within his offense and really give Bryce Young a chance to be, take even a bigger step in year 3 and year 2 under Canales.
Yeah, so fascinating because I think a lot of times we think of the T-Mac ceiling is kind of like pick 9, not to tease anything because we've got an episode coming up here. They'll come up next when we talk about the New Orleans Saints, but there's so much conversation around him going at 9 and then maybe thereafter. But I think this is a possibility. And I think I mentioned Dave Canales and his hands, his fingerprints that are going to be on this rebuild. You said it, like if you've worked with Mike Evans and you've seen the impact that he can have on an offense, that makes a ton of sense. I still do like the edge rusher there. And like, I think the Jalen Walker thing could make a ton of sense. I went with Michael Williams, but I think a lot of people really like the Jalen Walker fit there as well as a player who can be that impact rusher, but who can also do some linebacker things for you. So I think maybe one of the biggest linchpins in this early part of the draft is probably what the Carolina Panthers do at 8 because of the different directions that they could go with it. So that's going to be the fascinating thing to watch as we get closer to April, what the Carolina Panthers do when they are in fact on the clock at 8 overall. But thanks for joining us for another round of On the Clock. Make sure you like and subscribe to the show and stick with us as we do preview all 32 teams in this series leading up to the 2025 NFL Draft. From the draft room to the gridiron, the Draft Fellows have got you covered. Until next time, stay tuned and stay in the game.